Welcome. I'm Carl Misulis, and today we're going to talk about cognitive bias. This is part of a series on decision making. Cognitive bias was researched in depth by Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman and partner Amos Tversky. This is basically making decisions not based upon the best information. Cognitive bias is an umbrella term that includes many different types of biases, some of which are included in separate lectures in this series. So what are the cognitive biases? Well, there are many, and they're increasing as more and more research is done. Anchoring is one that we already have a lecture on. That's where someone gets stuck on a previous idea or a decision. For example, a physician who sees a patient and diagnoses them with a specific disease process might subsequently, when faced by data that might contradict that, still stick with that initial diagnosis. That happens more often than we would like. That's anchoring. Framing is another important cognitive bias. This is where we narrow the parameters of data that we present in order to give an implied conclusion. What does that mean? The most common is seen in a gain-loss scenario. Say, for example, if there's a contest, and I tell you that there's a 10% chance of winning a contest and getting a huge prize. Or I say, hey, there's this contest, but 90% of participants do not win anything. Well, you probably would go for it if I gave you the first spin and not the second. That is a dramatic example, but is an example of how we frequently present only part of the data when we are framing a question for someone to answer. Confirmation bias is another important one. This is where we tend to believe things if they are coherent with our previous beliefs or our previous decisions. For example, a news article that criticizes a group that you don't like, you're more likely to believe that. Whereas an article that criticizes a group that you're part of or that you have sympathies with, you're more likely to not believe them. Another one is implicit bias. This is where we generalize attributes to a team. For example, I might say that insert political party here are all liars, or are always wrong, or are always right. So as a result, by that implicit bias, we're giving attributes that are overarching to a broader group. Overconfidence is one that is seen in almost all spheres, everything from medicine to law to military to politics. This is where we start off life thinking we're perfect. The rest of life is us being taught otherwise. So the key is to try to use your mistakes and learn from them, and also use them as teaching tools, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. Why do we have these cognitive biases? Well, it's a perception of reality. It's how we see our own universe. It's the product of our experience and our training and our own psychological makeup. Our natural universe has an infinite number of variables, so we can only pick the ones to pay attention to that are important to us, and the ones which tend to put us in the best light possible. Well, I mentioned that the cognitive biases can occasionally be helpful. How do they possibly help? Well, it evolved for a purpose. One is loyalty. This is where we have a tendency to believe people that are part of our group. We have a tendency to believe people who are leaders. Armies could not function without loyalty, where you don't have to convince every single troop member about what you need to do. Also, some decisions need to be made immediately. So either it has to be a reflex or it has to be something that you learned. An example might be a fighter pilot who sees a surface-to-air missile incoming. Now, they could think about the physics and think about the aerodynamics and decide what they think is the best approach. Or they could do immediately what they were taught to do, which is to roll and bank and release a decoy. Seconds count in that circumstance, so you can't think about it. You have to be biased, in a good way, by your previous training. Well, where do we go from here? Well, we have to be aware of cognitive bias. We have to understand that it can be a force for good or evil. Don't try to avoid all biases. You can't, and you need some of them. But do think and rethink important issues when you have the time. Question your decision-making. Rethink important decisions. Did I make the right one? Should the processes I use to make that decision serve me well or not? Do what-ifs. And this is a recurring theme on many of the talks that I give. Think, well, what if I decide this? What if I decide that? And then subsequently go on. Now, be willing and to accept and admit that you are wrong. If you do make a mistake, accept it. fix it if you can, and try not to make the same mistake again. We can teach others by the experience of our own mistakes. Einstein did this, and as a young physics major, I read about him and heard that he would teach from the assumptions and the conclusions that he had reached that subsequently had to be rethought. I try to do the same thing in medicine that he did in mathematics and physics. So have objective and an analytic view of decision making, use cognitive biases when appropriate, suppress them when appropriate, and watch other of our video series so that you can see some of the cognitive biases, how they affect us, how we can use them, and how we can avoid them. Thanks for your time and attention. I hope you enjoy these videos from the Misulis group and from other educational videos.